Welcome to the first tutorial for SPSS. This will be for PM510, Principles of Biostatistics. Today we're going to go over the basic concepts of getting around SPSS. This is going to be including taking a look at the menu up here and all the options that you have, and essentially how you'll get to all the different procedures that you'll be using throughout the semester. We will also look at navigating between the data view and the variable view, creating variables, defining them, and also doing some manual input of data. And hopefully by the end of this tutorial, you'll be a little more comfortable with using SPSS for your analysis, and we'll be ready to do some of the homework that you'll be getting in the next couple of weeks. So when you open up the program, you're going to get a prompt, and it's simply going to ask what you'd like to do. So if you know the data set that you would like to open up and start working with, you can browse for it right here. Or if you'd simply just like to open up a blank data editor, as we will do, you can click Type in Data. If you have any interest in learning a little more beyond this tutorial in the first couple of weeks, they also have some built-in tutorials for you to take a look at. We'll go ahead and just select Type in Data. You can select OK. And we have our blank data editor. Looks very familiar to a number of other applications you may have used, Excel or Microsoft Access. Definitely has a lot more features that we'll get into than you would find in Excel. And so to start off, we're just going to investigate each of these pieces within the menu. And we'll start out with the most generic, what you find in most applications, which would be File and Edit. And in File, you see that we have New and Open. So we can create new data editors, and this will open up a new window. So it'll maintain the data editor that we have open right now and open up a second one. And so it's easy to have multiple data sets open actually at the same time. And if we scroll down, we'll see Output. So if you were to save the results of running a certain analysis, maybe you have ran a regression or did some type of non-parametric test and you saved them so you could look at them later, here you could also open up those types of files. You also see these types for syntax and for scripts, and this software actually does support writing scripts if you'd like to import data or run a procedure, but for the purpose of this class, it's probably easiest just to use their drop-down menus and to click through and follow their wizards for this class. Open, very familiar for most probably. And here you're going to be able to open up previous data sets, not only those that we've created within SPSS, but also if we wanted to import an Excel sheet, which we'll go over later in another lesson, you can go here and it's going to guide you through importing that and ensuring everything's in the correct order, and it'll import it and create a new data set for you. And we can also open up all of our output as well. And as I mentioned up here, you can actually do new output. So usually you're quite used to seeing these in programs. What may be new for you is this, which is called read text data. And that'll be the next topic that we do cover in our second lesson. And in this is for actually importing from a .txt file, an unformatted text file. And it has 6 steps that it'll guide you through to get any data that you may have in a text file. Pretty straightforward, and we'll go over a couple different ways in which you may have to actually import. Reading Cognos data is something you won't have to worry about. And grayed out here, you can see that we can save our data, save our output, and give it names that are appropriate. And we can also export. We can take any data sets that we might have in SPSS and we can export them to Excel, we can export them to other programs, and fairly easy for us to do. And we can also rename our data set. Now moving on, we'll head on over to Edit, and you have our normal functions with their hotkeys. I'm sure most are used to using this in other programs for cut, copy, and paste, and we can do most of this as well, and we can clear out variables or observations, and we can also insert variables in what they call cases or observations from Edit. You can also do variables and cases from directly in the data editor, both in the data view for cases and in the variable view for variables. and we'll go over that shortly. Moving on, we have view, and here you can actually change how the data editor looks. So what types of toolbars we do see, how our menu editor looks, what our fonts are, if we see grid lines within our data editor, which in most cases you probably want, and value labels, which we actually will unclick for right now, leave that as is, and we'll move on to the next one. And data actually contains some more advanced functions. Some you may encounter, but for the most part this is getting your data set formatted so it's ready for analysis. Most of our data is going to be in the form that is needed for analysis. Not too many changes that you're going to have to do, just because the class focus is really on learning these statistical procedures and not in formatting your data. And so you won't have to use anything like transpose or restructure, but you may want to copy your data set, or you may want to split a file into multiple pieces, and you may also want to select a certain number of cases or a random sample of cases. And so certainly a couple pieces in here, but a lot of it you won't have to worry about. Moving on, transform has a lot of useful functions that we're actually going to make use of, especially in these first couple of lessons. Compute variable is very useful. So given that you had a data set with variables in it, we could actually go in here and use variables within our data set to define a completely new variable. An example could be if we had height and weight and we wanted to get BMI, we could actually go into compute variable and tell it the formula for BMI, and it's going to automatically generate that variable for us. You may have run into this doing a similar function in Excel when you wanted to create new variables. If we scroll down, these two, recode into same variables and recode into different variables, are also very useful, and we will encounter those in the second lesson, so keep those in mind. And going all the way down to the bottom, you'll see random number generators. You'll learn a little bit about this in terms of randomization within the first lecture, and might be of interest to take a look at and get a little more familiar with. If we go ahead and move on, we're now going to go to the one where you'll spend the bulk of your time, and this is the area that you want to get most familiar with, and it's analyze. And this is going to contain all the statistical procedures that you are going to want to be familiar with. For the first couple of weeks, your focus is on exploratory analysis. You're trying to describe a single variable in most cases, or potentially explore the association between two variables. And we can do some of that from in here. We can get descriptives, so if we had some sort of continuous outcome and we wanted to get the mean, the standard deviation, the min, the max, all of those pieces, we can get that. And then frequencies. We can look at quantiles. If we have a categorical variable, we can look at the actual makeup of that variable. So if we had ethnicity, we could do a frequency count of the different types of ethnicity we have in the sample. And then as we move down through here, you'll start to see procedures, and as you go through the course, these all become more familiar. For doing a one sample t-test, an independent and paired sample t-test, or ANOVA. And in the latter half of the course, you'll look at correlation and regression. And the analogs to some of our parametric tests can be found under non-parametric tests. And here we see we have this legacy dialog, which is fairly useful for some of the procedures we will be running, such as chi-square and binomial. And so definitely want to look through all of these different submenus and become familiar. That way when you do have to approach homework, it's going to be a lot easier to find the exact area you need to go to, and just a lot easier so you're not sort of scrambling around and unsure of where to find a particular procedure. Direct marketing is not something that you're going to really have to worry about. Graphs is going to be very useful throughout the whole course, but especially in the first couple weeks when we're trying to describe data and what it looks like. And beyond giving some summary such as mean or standard deviation, it's always helpful to provide a visual look at our data. And so you can do pretty much anything you need to visualize within Chart Builder. And this is going to be an overall interface to make any type of graphic you're interested in. It could be histograms, could be line plots, box plots. All of this can be done from within Chart Builder. And they also have legacy dialogues, which again look back at if we want to make a bar chart or a line plot, and these are from older versions of SPSS. So if you just want to go to the exact template rather than having to reconstruct it from scratch in Chart Builder, this can be kind of helpful as well. Utilities and add-ons are more advanced pieces, not something you're going to have to really worry about. And window is the area in which we can actually just switch between windows. So if we have multiple data editors open and we have an output window open, you can easily just switch from here or whatever your preferred way is, depending on the operating system you're using. And then we have help. And this is obviously going to be very helpful. We do have some tutorials that are built in, so you can always check those out if you want a little bit more practice and to learn a little more how to use SPSS. And we can actually go into their web-based help system just by clicking here, and it's going to open up an index that we can search in. And so you'll see the search bar up here, and we can enter any keywords that we're interested in, and they give you a little background on how to actually use this help system. One example we could do is a random number. So if I wanted to find anything related to random numbers or mentions it, I can use this, and we will get anything and everything that mentions random numbers. So we could click into one, and it's going to give us some information on random number generators. So definitely a very helpful resource if you're confused about something or simply just want to learn more about it. You may find a lot within this help directory. But for right now, we'll go ahead and return back to our data editor. And that's really the makeup of this file system. You'll see some of these graphics down here, and they're actually just shortcuts for pieces you can do from within these drop-down menus. Obviously you've seen these in other programs, so you'll probably get used to using some of these for opening and saving and undoing and redoing pieces as you work with your data. And moving on, we're going to look at this overall piece right here, and what we're in right now, if we look at the bottom left, is the data view. And that means we're actually looking at our raw data if we had input or imported some data. So at the top you can see VAR. That means our variables are going to be here, and our observations or cases are in the rows. And so for a particular row, that's going to represent a observation, and as we go across, we're going to have the measurements for that observation on each of the variables that we do have. And switching over, even before we would input data, we could go into the variable view. Now the variable view is where you're going to fully define your variables, and this is really important within SPSS. The analysis that you're completing, it needs to know exactly what type of variable it's working with. And so here, these are our options for defining the variable. We give it a name and a type and all of these other options, and to better describe them, we're just going to do a simple example. And one of the most common variables that you will run into is gender. And so we type in the name gender, and it's going to fill in some of it for us, but obviously we're going to have to check each one to make sure it's correct. And the next one you're complete is the variable type. And so once we click this open, you will see we have a number of options, but for the most part you're going to be either having a numeric variable or a string variable, which is just made up of characters. It might be a person's name or a city, a large number of them. And you may be thinking, well, gender, we have male and female, so we'd most likely select string for this. But in reality, we could use string, or we could actually use a coding system, and rather than having to type male and female when we're inputting our data, we could just set it as numeric and say that 0 is female and 1 is male. And it's a little bit easier. It's a very common practice within data sets. Limits the number of errors. Instead of having to type out male and female, it's just a lot easier, especially in terms of checking your data later on to see if there's any errors. And so once we select numeric, which we're going to do for this example instead of string, we set the width. And width is really saying how large do you expect your number to be, and so we actually leave enough space for you to enter that number. So in this case, width, we're saying, well, we expect our number to be, including the decimal place, to be take up 8 places. But for our case, since we only have 1 or 0, that's only going to take up 1 width, and the decimal places would be 0. And you can see under width and decimals that this changes, but we can change this as needed without going back into type as well. And now we move on to label. And labeling can take time, but it is very important in any data set, and that's because it can provide additional information not just for yourself, but for others, and so they understand what exactly is this variable, and is there anything that you need to note to them so that anyone looking at the data set, or if you return to this 6 months later, you know exactly what this variable is. And in our case, since we're using a 0-1 system, we may want to tell ourselves that this is gender and that 0 equals female and 1 equals male. And we can further clarify this using values. And values is where we're going to create that association between the numbers and what the actual categories are. So if we click this open, we get another pop-up box, and we simply need to do value 0, and the label's female. We click add, and we do value 1, and the label's male. We add this one, and then we click OK. And now we have this association created, and we'll see what this actually means when we go back into our data view and how it can help out a lot. Going into our next column, we have missing, and luckily for the data sets we'll be using for the course, you're not going to encounter data sets with missing data for any of the variables. But in the event you did, or you ended up working with some sort of data set that did have missing values, essentially we're assuming no missing, so we'd leave it like this, but in some cases you may actually have special codes for missing. So rather than just leaving it blank within a data set, a researcher may use -99 to represent that data is missing. And it could be part of their procedure or protocol, and maybe as a confirmation that it could be that someone forgot to enter the data, but by having a -99, you're confirming that yes, it is missing. It's not that someone didn't enter it. And if you wanted that, you could always click down here and put -99, and it's going to know within this variable anytime it hits that number, it just means that it's missing and not that that's the actual value. But we'll just keep ours at no missing. Columns is just related to essentially how large we need our column to be, and so you can change the size. This is something where you'll notice when we have possibly a long name, if we had some sort of string variable, and so maybe we had city names, and so this column, this width, is going to increase as the largest width of a name we have. And so that's something you don't really have to do. It's really going to adjust itself appropriately based on the size of the strings or numbers for your variable. Alignment is usually auto set. If it's a numeric, it's going to align it to the right, and if it's a string, it's going to align it to the left, so you can quickly recognize strings and numerics within your data. And now the most important piece, along with setting the type, is the measure. And under the measure, what's most important is recognizing what type of data we have. And as you'll learn in class, we usually look at it as some type of continuous data, or a discrete variable of type, or ordinal or nominal. And for our variable gender, we have nominal, and that's essentially just saying that we have categories of data, and they're distinct categories that have no natural ordering to them. So you wouldn't order male and female in any particular way. Ordinal, an example could be if we had income from our sample, but rather than reporting the actual income, we categorized into low, medium, and high. And that would be an example of ordinal, where we have these distinct categories, but there is some natural ordering to them. And the reason you'd want to differentiate between those is actually having ordinal data opens up some different analyses you can complete that you could not do with nominal data. And so that's why it's always important to make sure you get the measure correct, because if you're planning on doing an analysis that maybe is looking at a trend in your categories, that is happiness and income, and you're looking at the trend that people that have larger incomes are less happy. You think it's the opposite. You need to specify its ordinal, or else the analysis actually won't work within SPSS. And within scale, it actually lumps in our discrete variables and our continuous variables really into one. And just as a side note, sometimes it can be confusing when you're trying to differentiate whether a variable is discrete or ordinal. Let's take, for example, go back to income, and we have categorized it into low, medium, and high. And if we're using a number system and we say, well, 1 is low, 2 is medium, 3 is high, you're saying, well, I have 3 numbers. It seems like it could also be considered discrete. But that's not necessarily true. And that's because we don't necessarily know that the difference between low and medium is going to be the same as between medium and high. In comparison, if we were to look at, let's say, number of children in a family, and we can count that, so it's discrete, it's countable units, but the way we can summarize that data also is a little bit different than we would for ordinal data. So it makes sense that if you had sampled families in a neighborhood and you got the number of children, if you said that the mean number of children was 3.2 for the neighborhood, although you can't have 3.2 children, it's still easy to interpret and people will understand. While if we tried to take our 1, 2, 3 system we had for low, medium, and high, and I said that the mean income is 2.8 by taking those numbers that we've assigned to low, medium, and high, no one's probably going to really understand what you're saying, because this is some sort of ordering that we've derived where there's not an absolute difference. That is, if we're looking at number of births or number of children in a family, the difference between 1 and 2 kids and 2 and 3 kids is the same. It's 1 kid, and it's set and it's fixed. But as I said, low to medium and medium to high income, we don't know if the difference between low and medium to high are the same. So that's just a side note. And another way to sort of sometimes differentiate the type of variable you're looking at is how you would actually put together a graphic. So if we had number of kids, we probably could look at a box plot, but for something like income categorized, we would probably look at doing a frequency count, and that'll kind of give you a hint of what your data type is. And the quicker you can get a grasp of that, the quicker you can understand, well, given I have this type of data, what type of analysis is appropriate. So moving on from that, we now have created our first variable. And so if we go back to our data view, we will see we now have gender in the first variable spot. So now we can say for our first observation, we can put in 0 and continue to fill in. This is assuming maybe we had paper forms that were filled out and now we brought them back and we need to start entering them. And looking at this, we see 0, 1, and unless you're the actual person collecting the data or the person entering or responsible for analyzing, you may not know what 0, 1 is. And even if you do, you may want to make it a little bit more readable, and so you can quickly recognize what is 0, what is 1. You don't want to mix them up. And luckily, we have this nice case in view called value labels, and what it's going to do is it's actually going to give you the labels that have been assigned to 0 and 1, and those are the ones we assigned within variable view. So it's kind of nice, and it's more of a preference. Some don't mind seeing the coding scheme, and some like to actually see what the categories are. Helps them to clean the data and check it and make sure everything looks okay as they're entering data. So really, again, it's more of a preference. And that's sort of a first introduction, and that's the first variable you created. We can always go back here and create another variable. We could do systolic blood pressure. This one's a little bit easier. It is a numeric. Decimals on this, we'd have it 0, and again, we could give it a label in case people don't know what our short acronym is for systolic blood pressure. And you'll notice the names over here I've given to the variables are fairly simple, and we'll go into naming conventions in the next lesson, but just at this point, just know that you want to keep your names simple but descriptive. And They can be a certain length. In most cases, you probably won't go over the maximum length provided. And again, the formal rules we'll go over when we actually start importing data where variable names have already been created. And that about covers the main pieces we want right now. The only other piece is for numerical type of variables. So once we've actually entered some data for the first 5 cases, and now we've created the second, you'll see this little period or dot, and that doesn't mean that that's there. That's actually just to represent that it's missing. So we haven't entered anything here yet. So if we put in 120, it's going to remove that. So we could throw in some example fake values here. And so these are the main pieces you should get and be used to, be able to define your variables, manually enter some values for those variables, and just give yourself a chance to really get familiar with the system. And once you're able to do that, you'll be ready for the second lesson where we'll actually start importing data, using some of these pieces in Transform, computing new variables from variables in our data set, and doing some recoding. And that about covers it. And that is all I have. Thank you, and have a good day.